Today I'm going to talk about Warp. It's the terminal for the 21st century. Before I get started, I'm Zach. I'm the founder at Warp. I just want to make sure the screen share works, right? I think it is. Okay, I'm going to assume it's working, right? So I'm the founder here at Warp. If you haven't checked out Warp, maybe before we get started, feel free to go over to warp.dev and download the app. Warp is a new version of the terminal that's meant to make it more accessible for individuals and make the terminal work for teams. We're in a beta right now, and it's also for Mac only, but if you want, please go ahead and check it out. So my agenda for today, I'm going to cover a bunch of things. So I'm going to start with this question of like, why build a new terminal? What's the reason to spend time on this? I'm going to talk a little bit about what's different about Warp compared to traditional terminals. I'm going to talk about how Warp is built. I'm going to give a demo of the app so you guys can sort of see what I'm talking about. I'm going to discuss our roadmap a little bit and talk about where we could take Warp in the future. I'm going to go over our business because that's something that always comes up is like, how do you build a business around the terminal? And then, depending on time, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of Q&A. So let me go ahead and get started. So why build Warp? Why build a new terminal? So I've been a developer for about 20 years now. I've always been a terminal user. You kind of can't, as a developer, I think avoid using the terminal. And so I've never been a terminal power user, but I've always used it. And one thing I've always experienced is I've always worked with developers who really were great at using the terminal and seen that if you can get good at it, you kind of get developer superpowers and you get a lot of extra productivity. But in order to get there, you need to spend a lot of time configuring your terminal. You need to learn a lot of obscure commands. It's kind of a pain in the ass to get there. And so one of the sort of product principles and that we have, and one of the parts of our mission is to make a version of the terminal that is accessible to all developers without all of that pain. The second sort of personal inspiration behind working on this is I used to be an engineer at Google. I was the engineering lead on Google Sheets, and then I was a principal engineer on Google Docs. And my experience there led me to believe that anytime you take a sort of desktop app and move it to the cloud and make it work for teams and make it collaborative, there's just a lot of productivity to be gained. And so we're trying to do something similar for the terminal. But let me go into some of the problems I think with the terminal UI more specifically, just to make it more concrete what I think there is to fix. So the first set of problems is really around the terminal UI being very archaic. So specifically, like, it's not mouse accessible, and I think this is a pain when you are trying to do work with input. Like, you try and click and put the cursor someplace, and the cursor doesn't go there. You try and double click a word while you're editing input and hit delete, and it deletes a character at the end of the line rather than what you have selected. And all this is just sort of very jarring to people who are new to the terminal, and also I think kind of a pain in the ass for people who use the terminal a lot. As I mentioned, the terminal has a lot of config requirements. So, the version that ships out of the box sort of is very underpowered. So it comes with a prompt that's not very useful. It doesn't come with completions. And so if you actually want to get it set up to be something that's useful, you have to spend a lot of time configuring it. I think that's just not ideal. A lot of times I have the experience of doing something once in the terminal and then forgetting it. And then, I constantly have to look things up. I got to go to Stack Overflow. And so the terminal, I think is notoriously difficult to learn commands. And then even if you do it once, it's kind of a pain to remember them and come back to them. It's very easy to cause catastrophic errors and outages from doing things in the terminal. So this is, there's famous examples of people bringing down big systems like Dropbox or, of beginners deleting their whole hard drive because they RF something and have a space in the wrong place. So it's a tool that has a lot of sharp edges in it. It's unstructured, and what I mean by this is like if you look at the terminal, it's just one big kind of buffer of text, which doesn't match what developers are actually doing in it right now. So usually developers are using it much more like a REPL, where there's a normal sort of input and an output associated with each input. And so if you were to take advantage of that structure, you could build very useful features. And then finally, the ecosystem around the terminal is not well defined. So, there are a lot of really powerful and awesome open source projects, some of them that are very, very popular, things like GoMindZSH or FZF. But like the mechanism for discovering these things is outside of the terminal. And for installing them is kind of haphazard. You're usually just like curling something into bash and hoping nothing breaks. And so I think there's an opportunity for building an ecosystem that's much more tightly tied to the tool. The second class of problems with the terminal, or maybe it's a better way to think of it is like opportunities, is that the terminal is still local single player software. It's a desktop app. And the consequences of this are that it makes things that are easy in other apps are hard to do in the terminal. So it's hard to sync your work across computers. If you've ever sort of switched work machines or you're switching between work and personal, you'll know that your terminal setup is likely something that you have to sort of manually sync. You might have a dot file repo, but it's not built into the app. For people who are working on a team, it's hard to onboard into a terminal environment. So it's hard to onboard into a particular stack, or it's hard to onboard into a project. And so one person might have environment variables set up that another person doesn't have set up. It's hard to share knowledge across the terminal. So there's no easy way of saying like, hey, I did something in the terminal. I want someone else on my team to see it. That's not built in. And then it's hard to collaborate in real time. So this is more important as people are not working in the same physical space. There's nothing like Google Docs or Figma style collaboration in the terminal. And so, one of the main ways that I used to learn how to become better in the terminal was to go stand by a more experienced developer's desk. I would see them do something cool in like SED or awk. And I'd be like, oh, that's cool. I could use that. That doesn't exist in the tool itself. So the next question is, is the terminal actually worth improving? Because you could just say, well, the reason the terminal has sort of stayed as it is for the last 40 years is just that there's not, such a big motive for making it better. But I think it really is worth improving. I think it's a super powerful tool, and some of the reasons why are as follows. So, one, text-based apps are the easiest apps to write. So every language, their hello world is a text-based app. If you compare writing a text-based app to a GUI, it just takes so much less effort to write a text-based app. And so developers are constantly writing them. Most servers on the internet are basically text-based apps. All of Docker is just running a series of text-based apps. And so they're ubiquitous and they're easy to write. They're also fast to execute and work with. So when you can use text-based apps entirely from your keyboard. It's a very ergonomic experience. This is why a lot of developers like them. It's just like a faster way to execute apps. They're infinitely configurable. So I think, with a text-based app, you're basically limited only by like the flags and parameters that you have, and that lets you do sort of any combination of parameterization of an app. Whereas if you were to think of like what can you do in the AWS like web console versus the AWS CLI, the CLI is infinitely configurable. The web console, you have to make choices around what functionality you expose. They're scriptable, so this is useful for developers, obviously, who are constantly trying to automate things. Much easier to automate a text-based app than it is a GUI. They're composable, so you can take the output of one and feed it into the input of another. This makes the apps that are text-based like very easy to interoperate with. And so in summary, like I think text-based apps are great. But what I don't think is great right now in traditionally is like the text-based app runtime, which is another way of thinking of the terminal. So, you can think of the terminal as an app or you can think of it as a platform. And if you think of it as a platform, I think it's a very lacking platform, but one that has a lot of potential. So what we're doing at Warp is we're trying to rebuild the terminal and basically the text-based app platform from the ground up to make it work better for all developers. And we're also trying to make it work for teams. So we're trying to make it cloud native and collaborative. The way that we're building it is we're building it using Rust, and it's all GPU accelerated. The reasons that we built it this way are primarily for performance. So, Rust by default, very, very fast apps. You can always still write a slow Rust app, but it's the sort of fastest baseline. It's much faster than writing it in the web platform. So that's why we chose Rust. It's also got very good cross-platform support. And so we want to take this same stack and have it, work across the web, work across Linux and Windows. Right now, like as I mentioned, it's only Mac. Yeah, and so that's how we built it. Let me go now and see if I can get a quick demo of Warp to work for people who haven't seen it, so they can get a sense of the types of things that we're building. So I'm going to stop sharing this and share a different screen. Okay. Okay. Cool. So this is Warp. Warp today is in a public beta. The main value to a user right now is really around making like the single user, the individual terminal user experience much better. And so the big things that you'll notice that are different when you use Warp are the way input and output work. So when I run a command in Warp, you can see that the output is grouped together with the input. And so this is kind of a cool primitive. It lets you sort of scroll around your terminal on a command by command basis. It also lets you take actions. So it's like if I ran ifconfig and I wanted to sort of just copy the output, or if I wanted to share it with my team, I could do that. I can make a permalink very easily to anything I do in Warp and sort of Slack it to people on my team or put it in a wiki. The second big thing that's different is the way input works. So if I go and search through commands here, I'll just sort of pick a prior command. You can see input by default works much more like it does in VS Code or a normal text editor. So I can like click, I can type where I put the cursor, I can double click and hit delete, I can do Command Z. But because we own this input component, you can also do much more sort of advanced things. Like I could do sort of multi-cursor editing here, and multi-line stuff just works normally. And so it's a much improved editing experience. We also are trying to make it so you don't have to do so much terminal configuration to have a good experience. So for instance, we ship with auto suggestions out of the box. We ship with completions, but completions that also show you documentation in line. So sort of like what you get in an IDE. We ship with a feature called workflows that makes it so that you can actually search for entire commands based on what the command does. So I can never remember how to undo my most recent Git commit. We have a library of these that's open source and extensible. We also have a really cool integration with Codex, where it's like if I want to sort of do natural language search to come up with a command, I can do it. So if I want to do count all line, count all, let's see, what's a good one here? Line count in Rust files. It will actually sort of generate the command for me and give me something that I can execute, which is pretty cool. So we've tried to really make the terminal a much more sort of powerful, intuitive, modern app out of the box. We have a command palette, we have some cool themes. And so yeah, this is basically what Warp is today. I'm going to stop sharing this and go back to what Warp could be in the future. and then we can get to some questions on the business side of it. So let me stop this and go back to my presentation. Okay. Okay. So as I mentioned, that's Warp today. Um, Let me talk just a little bit about I think where we could take it, and then I can get to questions. So some of the features that we have in mind and are things that are really around like sort of extending two parts of the app. So one is like, can we continue to make a better experience for the individual in the terminal? And then the second is like, what can we do to make the terminal work for teams and work within organizations better? So on the individual side, just to give some ideas, and we have a bunch of stuff, but I think just to make it concrete, one idea that we've talked about and sort of gotten some user feedback on, I think is pretty cool, is like, what is the ideal experience with the prompt? And so this is a mock showing a possible interactive prompt. It's one where you can imagine being able to install different like sort of prompt components based on what tools that you use. So that's one sort of example, single user feature. Another one is trying to make it better to work with data in the terminal. So anytime you have underlying text representation that's some sort of structured data, and this is an example of a CSV that we've rendered as a table, there's a possible rendering that we could do based on the fact that we know in Warp where a command starts and ends. So we have this block concept. So you could imagine this not just for CSV, but also for JSON or for Markdown. We can imagine making this extensible so that people can build custom renderings for their different tools. On the cloud side, just an idea to throw out is like, there's this problem of your settings don't stay in sync as you switch computers, you lose your history. So one thing we're interested in experimenting with is like, can you have cloud sync in the terminal, similar to how you have it in Chrome or in other cloud native tools? Is there an ecosystem that should exist, something more similar maybe to the VS Code extension store, where if you're working with different CLIs and they have different completions or workflows that should be accessible, that you could sort of seamlessly search for, discover, install, those things from right within the terminal. Can you make it so that commands are shareable? So this is a common problem on teams where people, onboard to a team, and like chances are if you're doing some set of commands, other people on your team might find them useful. And so making those commands natively shareable within the terminal is something that we're working on now. Real-time sharing. So this is sort of like Google Docs or Figma style sharing, where you could have multiple people sort of in the same terminal session, with the use case being, hey, I want another set of eyes on something. I need help debugging, or I need to make sure that before I run this command, I'm not going to be doing something wrong. Terminal notebooks. So, most places I've worked have some set of sort of READMEs or wikis that are used by DevOps that could be used for onboarding, and they always live in some external tool like Confluence or a Google Doc. And I think there would be value in bringing those things directly into the terminal where they're executed. And so that's like, a sense of where we see, some of the cool features to build. The final question that we usually get around Warp is like, we're a venture-backed startup, and the question is, well, what's the business that we're building? How is that going to work? And the way that we're currently thinking about it is that, Warp today is free for individuals. I would not imagine that ever changing. Um, but we're exploring, sort of similar to like how a company like Figma does things, a sort of paid set of team and enterprise features which companies would pay for. And what that would look like, just like very, very roughly, would be something like, there's an individual tier that's for free, and then there's a set of features that are around collaboration, or they're around sort of administration of the terminal, or they're around infinite history, they're around the cloud, things that would have a cost to us to run because there's a sort of cloud component to them that teams would pay for. And then finally, a higher price point where it's for enterprises that want to sort of deeply, integrate with Warp and who want sort of advanced features around security and compliance. So that's a business that we're trying to build. Right now, we haven't even sort of started testing these team enterprise features. We're just getting going on that. And so today, our focus is really like, let's just build the best product that we can for individual developers and have them try it out and share it and give us feedback. So yeah, that ends the sort of planned presentation part of this chat. I'm going to go ahead and see if we have any sort of Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Zach. Before we jump into the Q&A, I just wanted to share some thoughts that were shared on our Discord chat, where people have been saying they're super excited about the future of the terminal in general, because the CLI is probably one of the most important part of development, more than the UI compared for developer audiences. So it's so important to build these good experiences. I got so excited looking at your slides and seeing what's possible in the future. So yeah, very, very exciting. Thank you so much for sharing that. We do have a few questions. So the first question is, I think, yes. So why do you need a GitHub login to use Warp? I'm using a CLI password manager, so all my passwords could be compromised. How do you guarantee any of my commands/passwords won't be stolen?
Yeah, so there's a couple questions there. I think the first one is like why have login, or why specifically have GitHub login? So the reason that we have login is really so that we can do things that are based on user identity. So for instance, if you're creating like a library of commands that you use and you want those commands to be available on multiple computers, you sort of have to have some concept of a logged in user. As we add Teams features, I think it's going to be even more important. Like if you want to sort of collaborate across a set of people on a team, again, you sort of need to know who those people are. And so that's why we have login. We launched with GitHub login only because it was sort of just like expedient, and most developers who are trying Warp have GitHub. But we're actually, I think this week, we're launching with login with Google or login with email, so you don't have to associate with a GitHub account. I think the second part of the question, I think, is like really related to like what data does Warp sort of store on the cloud. And so the short answer is like we don't ever sort of store any of the commands you run or the outputs of those commands. We do store while we're in beta, we're collecting sort of like usage data so that we can understand like what features are being used, like are we retaining users, that type of thing. But the actual contents of your commands and what you're doing, there's no difference between Warp and sort of using another terminal.
Awesome, thank you. And we've got another question. Timeline for Windows executable?
That's a good question. I don't know the firm answer, but like, unfortunately, I think Windows is probably going to be the third or fourth platform that we support. So if you sort of look at our open GitHub issues, the number one request is actually for Linux. And then we're also very interested in doing like a web rendering to sort of facilitate a Cloud Shell use case and a sharing use case. So I don't have a firm timeline for Windows, but we would love to support Windows. It's kind of a function of how quickly we can build our engineering team and support more platforms.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, another question here. Will there be any integration with Warp and IDE's terminals like VS Code? It's a good question.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So this is another highly requested feature. We would love to do this. I think that it's mainly like a question of technically how do we do it. For VS Code specifically, since it's a web-based rendering, I think that first Warp needs to support a web-based rendering. If we could do that, I'm pretty sure that we can get Warp into VS Code. We may also be able to do some things that make Warp sort of more usable with VS Code as a standalone app in the short term around like deeper integration when you click a link from Warp going to the right line and column in a VS Code file. So we're definitely interested in making the Warp experience work really well with IDEs and with VS Code specifically.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Amazing. There was another comment. Again, it was on Discord. This person doesn't have a YouTube account, so they couldn't send it on here. But I quickly popped it on here. So the comment they actually had was, one thing I've been curious about before, but never looked into it, is terminal accessibility, like for disabled folks. I'm curious how Warp shifts that state. Like, does it make certain things easier, but others harder to support, for example?
Yeah, great question. So we've actually put a decent of effort into this. There's an engineer on our team, Agata, who has been working on accessibility for visually impaired folks who use Warp. I think it's like the state of terminal accessibility in general is very, very bad. And so Warp, I think today we could say that we are the most accessible because we have some more structure. So for instance, like we have the ability through voiceover to sort of read the contents of blocks and like associate like what command produced what output. And so this is actually something that we've put in a decent amount of work on so far and are really interested in like being far and away the terminal that is most accessible, for all sorts of users.
Cool. Like, yeah, that's cool to hear that you've got someone like dedicated to that, because that is super
Yeah, no, it's
important.
it's really
Yeah.
cool. Yeah,
Yeah, and of course, like super. I don't know. I just feel like it's not talked about as much. So that was a really good question.
yeah,
And I just wanted to share some some comments. Thank you, Zach, for the demo and the answers. Great talk. We'll try Warp for sure. Thanks. Amazing.
cool.
Well, we only have 3 more minutes, and I actually had one last question just because I just thought of it. And
Sure.
it's related to, is Warp open source?
So Warp, the actual core client, is not currently open source.
Hmm.
We have a few open source repos that people can contribute to, and the
Okay.
contributions will show up in Warp. So if you want to write your own workflow, you can do that. If you want to contribute your own theme, you can do that. There's a couple, like for Warp open source, there's an UI framework that we've developed internally that we plan on open sourcing. I don't know how
Mhm.
long it's going to take. It's sort of like kind of intertwined with our app right now. And then I think it's likely, but I don't really want to fully promise it, that we will open source the full
Mhm.
client. I think it's in the interests of our users and the interests of our business to do it. I don't have a firm time frame on it or exactly like what license it will be, but I think it's quite likely that we'll actually open source
Yeah.
the whole thing. And then, one sort of final comment on that is like, if so some people want to guarantee that if Warp as a company doesn't succeed, the tool won't go away. And so I'm very comfortable saying that if Warp the company didn't ever exist, then the whole thing would be open source so people could continue using it.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah. It's one of my
Mm.
favorite questions, just because a lot of our community as well are into
Yeah,
contributing to open source projects as well. Amazing.
yeah.
So the last thing I just wanted to pop up on the screen here is from Elvis, someone from Warp, I assume, who
Yes.
has said that you have a Discord server. So feel free, everyone who wants to learn more about Warp and get involved in the community, to join in, because I think this is definitely a really important conversation. I'm really excited to try Warp myself. So
Yep. Yep. So yeah, we have a Discord. You can say hello to us at hello@warp.dev. We're hiring. If there's anyone who's interested in, I assume people here are interested in working on developer facing stuff. And so, yeah,
yeah.
very excited to chat today.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Zach. And we will see you at some point in the future. Thank you for contributing to DevXConf.
Thank you so much for having us. This was a lot of fun.